All right. Hey, this is Zane Horowitz and everyone here at the Oregon Journal Club for August 25th, 2022. And today's Journal Club is, we titled it For the Birds. This is a journal club of a couple of different things where sometimes the bird poisons you and sometimes where we poison the birds in return. It was sparked by a recent paper on avian toxins, but it made me think back to when I had written a couple of different things for different formats on rhabdomyolysis, and sort of the intro paper I have here is The Patient with Rhabdomyolysis, Have You Considered Quail Poisoning? And this paper from the Canadian Medical Association Journal presents 3 case reports of one is a 62-year-old woman, 7 hours eating a meal of fresh roasted quail, presented with muscle aches and pains and dark urine, ended up having a CK of 5,500, doubled up to 11,000 the next day. She got some fluids, got better. Her transaminases were up to 200 and 400, which goes along with rhabdo. And by 4 days later, she was feeling better. She also had myoglobin detected in her urine. Second is a 19-year-old man who had pleuritic chest pain and muscle aches for 24 hours. It started 3 hours after eating quail. But then he went ahead and visited a gym and did an exercise program, so there's maybe a confounding issue there. He also came in with dark urine that was positive for myoglobin. His initial CK was 1520, and his myoglobin was 580. And he got better after hydration. And the last person was a 40-year-old male who had pain in his shoulders and his legs with some nausea for 3 days. He ate quail for dinner, and the symptoms began about 8 hours before that. And he also engaged in, it says, intensive muscular activity the next morning. It doesn't really say he went to the gym, but something along those lines. His CK was 1,800 and his myoglobin was 600, and he got hydrated and better. So all in all, CKs in the few hundreds to up to 1,000, the top one being 11,000, all consistent with rhabdo. So why does this occur? We know rhabdo is breaking down the muscles. Several things get released: creatine kinase, potassium, myoglobin. And myoglobin is the thing that turns your urine dark brown, gives a positive urine dipstick for protein, sometimes for blood as well. They talk about some of the more exotic things that might cause this, like some of our favorite tox trivia points, like Hoff disease, which is eating buffalo fish, wild mushrooms, which is the man on horseback, wild mushroom, and also this entity eating quail, which they call Cortinarism. And it's mostly quail in the Mediterranean, although this is a case report from Greece. And it's the European common quail that seems to migrate in the autumn that causes the problem. And they often cite back, as a lot of these papers do, way back to Exodus in the Old Testament of the Bible, that something back there made them think that maybe it was rhabdo. Obviously, they weren't getting CPKs in the desert in the BC era. There's not much to do for this except to recognize it, that it probably goes way underreported, that it's basically being a problem of being at the top of the food chain, as many things are, like red tide is. The quail themselves likely eat hemlock seeds, so Contium maculatum, and the hemlock probably causes, instead of the florid hemlock poisoning with complete motor weakness, just causes muscle pain and aches in the people who are afflicted by this, and they develop rhabdo, which is generally self-limiting with supportive care alone. So there you have it, a new word, Cortinarism, a rare cause of rhabdo due to eating quail. So for our primary presentation is the newest paper from the folks at Harvard. It talks about several types of avian toxins. I have our senior fellow Ruby to tell us about that.
Hi everyone. So I will spare y'all with mispronunciation of all the genus and species of this and just review the article on avian toxins, which is super fascinating. So it's a review article of poisonous and toxic birds, and they go over specific treatments besides supportive care and really go into the theories on how these birds are able to acquire the toxin and the ability to prevent self-intoxication. So first off, they talk about the Katui and Ephrida quality birds, which they're colorful birds, and there are images in this article. If someone's able to pull it up, and we'll share it with everyone. There's really pretty birds. And these birds specifically, they're endemic to New Guinea. The initial analysis, when they were trying to find the toxin, they had identified a toxic alkaloid, trichotoxin, but subsequently studies show that this is, instead of the trichotoxin, it's the big trichotoxin, which this is concentrated really in the breast and the belly feathers of the bird. Interestingly, the toxin can be transferred from the feathers onto the nest and onto the eggs to deter predators. So a little bit about the toxin, the trichotoxin. It's a potent neurotoxic steroid alkaloid. It has neuro and cardiotoxic properties. It's originally found in the poison dart frogs, and they target voltage-gated sodium channels and really your nerves and muscles, and it stabilizes the open form of the channel. So it would normally bind to the receptor, and there's persistent activation and persistent depolarization of the cells. I believe the very last page should be the photo number 1. It's weird, but so for this specifically, unfortunately, there's no antidote for it. Theoretically, it was brought up that you could treat it with tetrodotoxin and for its antagonistic effects on the sodium channels, but that's just wild and crazy. But for its toxicity in rodents, the LD50 rodents have muscle contractions, convulsions, salivation, dyspnea, and death. The birds tend to carry a lower level of toxin compared to the frogs itself, and with this exposure, someone can develop numbness, burning, nausea, or a bitter taste with it. And then the toxin from the feathers can also aerosolize, and upon inhalation can cause sneezing, numbness, and burning of the mucous membranes. And this is thought that the birds acquire the toxin from eating the mildred beetles. And another theory is that both the bird and the beetles get their toxins through eating a similar plant, if you will. So the next bird that they talk about that Zane has gone over already is the common quail. So migratory birds. Really, we see this more in the European subspecies and during autumn season. So upon some consumption, people can develop the botulism, which is really the myopathy and rhabdo that Zane had talked about. So they go into treatments besides fluid resuscitation. They talk about urine alkalization, and then consider a role of hemodialysis for severe renal failure, and then plasmapheresis for life-threatening cases of rhabdo. And this toxic hemlock, thought to be from eating the seeds of the poison hemlock. There was another theory that they briefly mentioned, an alternative theory, in which why certain patients are symptomatic and certain aren't, which would be a hereditary enzyme deficiency in the affected individual. So then the next bird that they talk about is the spur or spur-winged goose, which these birds are endemic to the wetlands of the sub-Saharan Africa, and they acquire their toxin by eating blister beetles. Really, it's terpenes and cantharidin and dimethylcantharidin, which cantharidin, it binds to your phosphatase 2A and inhibits the serine-specific protein phosphatases. So it's important for neural transmission, muscle contraction, glycogen synthesis, and an array of different mechanisms. It can be absorbed directly through the skin or mucous membranes, and people can have common skin findings like a dermatitis with blister formation. Specifically, the serine proteases also affect and disrupt the desmosomal plaque, in which this can cause acantholysis, intradermal blistering, and non-specific lysis of the skin. Ow. And people subsequently can get profound dehydration from fluid loss, and it's a pro-inflammatory state, and it also affects your renal cortical duct, so multiple mechanisms for fluid loss. Patients can have abdominal pain, hematuria, cool and mottled skin, and it's considered an abortifacient. So for this one, it's more so supportive care, but you can get activated charcoal for recent ingestions. Next, a little bit closer to home, North American ruffed grouse, which is a non-migratory bird that is found in the Appalachian Mountains. So they have granulotoxins by consuming mountain laurel. And this toxicity is really interesting. It's seen in the late winter, early spring, and it's thought because of the snow that covers the land, these birds are forced to feed off of like trees and tall or shrubs, if you will. So there's a ditropine that binds to a group 2 receptor site on your sodium channels, and then this prevents an activation of the channels. It's also neurotoxic and cardiotoxic as well. Patients can get dizziness, weakness, diaphoresis, hypersalivation, nausea, vomiting, paresthesias. And then life-threatening toxicity is with arrhythmias within the sodium channel and supportive management for these patients. And then just a couple more. Bronze wings. A medium-sized pigeon that's native to Australia. They acquire monofluoral acetate from consuming flowering plants. So monofluoral acetate, that's the main component in rodenticide, and SMFA, or compound 1080, also has neural and cardiotoxicity, can be absorbed in the GI tract or as well as the mucous membrane, and it affects your cellular respiration, either in the citric acid or the Krebs cycle. So floral acetate will combine with acetyl-CoA, and that gets metabolized into floral citrate. Now, floral citrate can't enter the citric acid cycle. It then gets further converted into 4-hydroxy transaconitate, which inhibits aconitase and therefore inhibits citrate and succinate metabolism. With a high citrate, it can also inhibit phosphofructokinase and then also bind to calcium, causing hypocalcemia. So as for toxicity, you can see seizures, excessive salivation, vomiting, defecation, and tenesmus. And treatment-wise would be acetamide or sodium bicarb. The last one, hoopos. The European hoops are found in Africa, Asia, and Europe, and it's a symbiotic bacteria that they have in their uroglial glands that produce dimethyl sulfide. There's really no human toxicity if it's consumed, but more so researchers who work with these birds are just miserable when they're exposed to noxious fumes for hours handling the birds. So that's a summary of all the birds. The last part is really looking into how are these animals able to acquire these toxins without really becoming toxic. So in dart frogs, it's been found that they have a single amino acid substitution that changes the frog's sodium channel and therefore resistant to it. And then similarly, there's a type of snakes, natricine. They also have a mutation in their sodium channel as well that allows for resistance against tetrodotoxin when they consume the foods. So really, evolution is kind of cool. Predator and prey have both adapted to this, and then there are other explanations in which herbivores are able to modify the alkaloids in the gut, so therefore it converts it into a non-toxic form, and then they can convert it again into a toxic form when they want to shoot lasers out of their herbivore self. And then the chrysalid beetle can also move the toxins into a specific exocrine gland that's further away from all the other important tissues. So overall, really cool. Birds rock.
Yeah, thanks. That was great. These are all obscure toxins. Each one of them perhaps a trivia factoid to be asked in rounds or somewhere else. Each one is fascinating. The patui with the tetrodotoxin-like bactrotoxin, which so far there's been no cases in man where they've needed to be intubated and ventilated, similar to like pufferfish poisoning. And the other is the effects of eating things like garanotoxin, which we've talked about with mad honey, and monofluoroacetate, the sort of potent, now banned pesticide, which disrupts the Krebs cycle and causes acidosis and seizures. I hadn't seen any evidence, nice pictures in this article, but no evidence that any of these ever get up the food chain high enough where man eats them, except maybe a couple of random quail cases with mild rhabdo. So thanks. That's how the bird poisons us. What happens when the other way comes around? So for the first article in that group, I'm going to turn it over to Joe, talking about, he's a dog lover, and we gave this article to him, unfortunately, about, what happens when we're trying to poison the birds, but we miss the species.
Yeah, it's just kind of a sad article. I don't like anything where dogs, don't do well. But this is a paper called A Review of 29 Incidents Involving 4-aminopyridine, a non-targeted species, reported to ASPCA, Animal Poison Control Centers. So just a little background. 4-aminopyridine is a potassium anion channel blocker that increases the release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction and in the central nervous system. It can be used therapeutically in humans for enhancement of cholinergic activity in patients with illnesses such as MS. Some of the clinical signs of toxicity include salivation, tremors, hyperexcitability, muscle incoordination, but you can also get cardiac arrest and respiratory arrest, eventually leading to death. It's rapidly and completely absorbed orally, but pretty poorly absorbed dermally. And clinical signs generally start to occur 10 to 15 minutes after an oral exposure, with death occurring 15 minutes to 4 hours later, based on the LD50 of some previous studies that were done. So in animals, it's usually used to control the red-winged population, or the populations of red-winged, yellow-headed, rusty, brewers, blackbirds, grackles, cowbirds, pigeons, and starlings. Basically all these birds that you find on farms that eat grain. They're used in areas like feedlots and farms to basically poison these birds that will eat most of the grain or cause damage. The poison is available in treated corn pieces, or mixed grains, where it's mixed at 0.5 or 1% concentrations, and this brand is called Avitrol. And again, in humans, it can also be used therapeutically to treat neuromuscular dysfunctions associated with things like muscular sclerosis by enhancing the transmission of the synapses. It's also been used in things like botulism, Lambert-Eaton syndrome, myasthenia gravis, but it's mainly used for multiple sclerosis. So this paper, it was basically a retrospective study of cases called into the ASPCA Animal Poison Control Center database from the year 2002 to 2011. They found 29 exposures of non-targeted species involving 4-AP bird bait. The inclusion criteria is basically that if it was involved 4-AP bird bait and it was only one agent causing the exposure. And what they found was a total of 29 exposures. The most common non-target species, unfortunately, was canines at 25 out of the 29, which is 86%. The weights of these canines range from 1.8 to 38.6 kilograms, with an average of 19.6. And the ages range from just a puppy at 0.3 years old to 13 years old. But the average age was 3 years old. Felines accounted for the second most common, with 3 and at 10%. And the most common exposure area was in Colorado. Second was Nevada, then Arizona, and Pennsylvania. So 14 of these were assessed by the APCC staff as toxicosis or suspected toxicosis. So the clinical signs and the whole situation was fairly quickly recognized as being an AP4 poisoning, and all of these involved canines. The most common clinical sign was tremor at 35%. Then you had hypersalivation, which also at 35%. Seizures were the second most common at 29, tachycardia, and then ataxia. Onset of symptoms was known in 13 of the 14 of these cases and ranged from as quickly as 5 minutes to 5 hours after ingestion, but the average time of onset was 89 minutes. Outcomes were known in 6 of the 14 cases. 1 death was reported after 4 hours after exposure, and 5 patients made full recoveries with provisional of supportive care. This supportive care included activated charcoal, anticonvulsants, muscle relaxants like diazepam and methocarbamol, and then just supportive care like IV fluids. In these patients, the clinical signs lasted quite a bit, so from 15 to 84 hours after exposure, with the average being 37 minutes. So one of the things that this paper notes is that in their study, there was a longer time to onset of these patients eating that patients that were called into the Animal Poison Control Center than the previous studies that look at LD50s. So they think that this is due to animals, these canines eating smaller doses, or the doses just being less than the LD50 that they ate. So, for example, a 21 kilogram dog would need to ingest 50 grams of the treated corn to reach an LD50, which is quite a lot when most of these animals probably just had like a small amount. So this is just something to be on watch for when you have any animals like me. If you see, especially if you live on a farm and you see a dog with any of these symptoms, things on your differential list should be CNS stimulants like caffeine, antidepressants like TCAs, SSRIs. Then you always have amphetamines or similar agents such as methamphetamines, methylphenidates, and also decongestants like pseudoephedrine. And then other pesticides such as strychnine, zinc phosphide, organophosphates, carbonates are some of the mycotoxins such as penetrium A is what they mentioned. And that was my paper. So all around, I thought it was kind of an interesting study. I wasn't super familiar with or 4-aminopyridine. And I have a dog, which I very much love a lot. And I will have to keep her safe from any corn I find on the ground.
Right, yeah, that's maybe the take-home message is if there's stuff laying on the ground, don't assume it's just like somebody who was eating it dropped it. It could have been one of these horrible toxins. So Avitrol has been around for decades and decades. It's this concentrated 4-aminopyridine to kill these these predator birds that eat up crops. So it's out there. So that's the animal side of the equation. Let's move over. Humans sometimes get into this. It is also very rare, but 4-aminopyridine is sort of an orphan drug in and of itself. So tell us at least about a couple of different cases. We'll start with Sammy. Tell us about one case and a bit of a literature review from the folks in Pittsburgh.
Yeah. So Joey and Zane kind of touched on, 4AP has been around for quite a while, originally developed in the 60s as what's called an avicide, but according to the manufacturers, only about 1% of the birds are actually dying, and it's more to kind of just scare them away. But if you look up PETA and other similar companies' take on that, they'll say no, it's killing all the birds. But so developed to get birds away from crops and stuff like that. So a little bit about, and so I just wanted to show a quick video of a bird supposedly affected by it. The thought is that it kind of makes the birds have these involuntary diaphragmatic contractions and cause them to make a distress call, and then kind of scares other birds that hear it, and then makes that bird scared. So I'm sorry you won't be able to see it on Zoom, but here's just a bird for you guys. Having a little kind of choreoathetotic movements, just kind of like twitching along. And similar to what some of the human exposures are described as. So a little bit about the mechanism of the 4-AP. Like we talked about, it selectively blocks voltage-gated potassium channels, ultimately prolonging action potential, increasing calcium influx, and therefore increasing acetylcholine release at the synapse. So you get kind of expected symptoms of increased acetylcholine, such as like extrapyramidal symptoms, and then other things such as kind of seem cholinergic in nature, like severe diaphoresis, altered mental status, seizure activity. So with that mechanism, has a lot of interesting medication potential and uses. In fact, it was approved in 2010 to improve ambulation in patients with MS. So really there's implications with any of those demyelinating diseases or any disease that can affect really the neuromuscular junction, because this seems to improve action potential, conduction, and neurotransmitter release. And we'll actually talk about one kind of interesting case in a second. So let's see here. Let me mute my computer. So we talked a little bit about the dosing range. In humans, it seems like doses greater than 25 milligrams, you started having effects like seizures. As far as some of its kinetics, seems to have pretty negligible protein binding, but a pretty large volume of distribution, and then a half-life of about 3 to 4 hours. So this paper talks about a main case, which was a 37-year-old male with a history of multiple sclerosis and depression. He was generally watched by his brother, who left him alone for about an hour, and then came back, found his brother confused and naked on the ground, agitated, with pills in his mouth. And it seemed to be his 4-AP pills. So the patient was agitated, delirious, had slurred speech, profuse diaphoresis, profusely diaphoretic, tremulous, and was taken to the ED. There he ultimately had normal electrolytes, negative tox screen, normal CK, normal CBC, EKG showed some sinus tachycardia, but otherwise no interval abnormalities. He had a normal CT, was initially given 10 of lorazepam and some fluids for his agitation and tachycardia. So he ultimately got 110 milligrams of diazepam and 50 IV diphenhydramine, and then actually needed to be intubated due to continued delirium and agitation. He was admitted to the ICU, where he got more benzos. He ended up getting 20 of more diazepam, and then sedated on propofol. And then with just supportive care over the next 2 days, improved, was extubated, and then his delirium kind of continued throughout his hospital course, and he ultimately returned to baseline by day 7 and was discharged. So they did check for AP levels in this patient, and about 6 hours after the ingestion, his level was like 140 nanograms per milliliter. And then after after 24 hours, the level was 6. So kind of consistent with that half-life. So the article then does a review of several instances of 4AP toxicity in humans. I'll just give you brief couple liners about each one, and you might see a trend about some of their symptoms. So in the 70s, in like 78, there was a manufacturing plant, and 3 employees were were thinking they were taking Spanish fly, which is a new drug I learned about, which apparently was used as like a aphrodisiac. But I couldn't find great information on the mechanisms. But instead, they took 4AP. They got profusely diaphoretic, agitated, had convulsion-like movements, tachycardic, and then one of them had 3 tonic-clonic seizures and was intubated and received a lot of benzos and ultimately returned to normal by day 5 and discharged. The second of the 3 had severe diaphoresis, altered mental status, delirium, combativeness, was not intubated, but got a lot of benzos. Third patient actually induced his own vomiting within 10 minutes of taking the pills and didn't get any symptoms. So I guess that's a win for like Ipecac or vomiting induction. So another case report was a year later. So this one was kind of interesting, and there was an outbreak of botulism type E in Alaska. So they treated it with 4AP because, like we talked about, there's this potential for increasing neuromuscular junction acetylcholine concentrations. So the thought is maybe it could help. They didn't really say if it helped much, but they did get toxic from the 4AP and got delirious, developed seizures, and one of the patients passed away from ultimately like respiratory failure. And then those patients required high amounts of benzos as well. So in the 90s, there's another one where a group of patients intentionally took an overdose. They had seizure activity and ultimately intubated, required a lot of benzos. In the 90s, a patient with MS was expecting to do a lot of movement one particular day, took some extra of her medication of the 4AP, and ultimately got toxic from that, got profusely diaphoretic, tremulous, delirious, and ended up needing a lot of benzos. So there was a couple other cases. I mean, there's several other with those symptoms. There's a couple cases that highlight some of the cardiotoxicity that can happen as well. So one patient in their 30s thought he was taking, a 22-year-old thought he was taking like some sort of muscle building supplement, but it was actually 4AP. Developed cardiac tachydysrhythmias, right bundle branch block. He ended up having a concentration in the 300s for that case. But he seems like he didn't have severe neurosymptoms, so that was kind of odd. So there's a couple other instances where there was cardiotoxic effects. So one person effectively developed heart failure with a bradykinesis and an EF of 24%. And then ultimately this resolved with supportive care. So overall signs and symptoms of 4AP toxicity are like neuroexcitatory issues such as seizures, extrapyramidal movements, bradykinesia, choriathetosis, a few cases of the opisthotonos, and then delirium, a large delirium component and agitation. And then secondarily, cardiac seems to be less frequent, but definitely occurs. And the main cardiac symptoms discussed in all these cases were things like hypertension, SVT, different SVTs, AFib, and then like I talked about, an instance of hypokinesia, bradykinesia. And then management of these generally there's no great studies, but it makes sense that benzos are going to be helpful for both their neuroexcitatory symptoms and seizures. And then there's really just a lack of data to say for sure what else we should use as far as acute management. So those were the highlights of this paper.
Yeah, no, great, Sammy. This is sort of an orphan drug. It's used for multiple sclerosis, sometimes off-label for other indications, and people may overdose on purposely, inadvertently, and have a variety of neuroexcitatory problems. As always, there's always that one case report of the worst that could be out there, and some places will let you get away with saying the highest level ever recorded was such and such. Remember in the last set of articles, the level was 140. Here we have a case that Emma will tell us about where it reached new heights.
New heights. Not the record you want to hold. I'm Emma. I'm one of the first-year fellows. So I will try not to belabor any of the other points about 4AP toxicity, but this was a case I'll just jump into the case. This was a case of a 34-year-old male. He had a history of MS. He was found unresponsive with 3 pill bottles at his side. He was on valacyclovir, temazepam, and this 4AP for his MS. When he arrived to the hospital, his vital signs were significant for some hypertension, 155/82, a heart rate of 106. He's a little tachypnic with a respiratory rate of 24, normal temp. They had him on 2 liters of nasal cannula. His glucose was normal. He was seemed like he had symptoms that were similar to other cases, so he was tremulous, but they described him as awake but not responding to any questioning and not following any commands, but localizing to pain with no vocal deficits, normal pupils. And then they also described this diaphoresis and piloerection. For him, I do think his initial presentation of being sort of tremulous and awake but kind of more sleepy, non-responsive might have a lot to do with the temazepam that he took at the same time, less agitated. So he started having tonic-clonic seizures. They report him being bolused with lorazepam up to 8 milligrams, then intubated, placed on a lorazepam and propofol infusion for sedation. They additionally loaded him with 1 gram of phenytoin and 300 milligrams of phenobarbital, then added a phenobarbital infusion. But unfortunately, this patient, they say clinically, continued to have frequent and recurrent seizures. The lab values, he had an elevated white blood cell count, which is not surprising if he was continually seizing. The rest of his labs were fairly unremarkable. He did have a lactate of 3.4, which is not bad for somebody who's seizing. The CK wasn't elevated. The NI-GAP was 12. And the initial gas they got was a 7.22 with a PCO2 of 65, but it sounds like directly after intubation, so had a little hypercapnia. CT of the head was normal, chest normal. So his EKG was sinus rhythm 88 beats a minute, normal QRS, normal QT. So it's kind of interesting that he, even though he had ended up having a 4AP level of 530, which is the highest ever recorded, according to this. He had no cardiotoxic effects, presumably at all, totally normal EKG. He did also have a valacyclovir level of 7.5, which is higher than therapeutic maxes are about 4. So he went to the ICU, and they don't really talk about much of the other management. I presume they kept him on this propofol and phenobarb and lorazepam drips, but he continued to seize, and he stopped seizing on hospital day 3. They say he didn't get extubated until hospital day 12, but he was discharged with a completely normal mental status and neurologic exam. And so that's pretty dramatic effects there. So they go on to discuss, that seizures are common with 4-AP, overdoses. And before that, they say the highest ever published was a level of 233. And in the case with the level of 233, they were given lorazepam boluses and the seizures subsided. And so they contrast that to their patient who was refractory to treatment with multiple anticonvulsant medications. They definitely talk about the fact that valacyclovir itself could, in theory, also cause seizures in overdose. However, that's less common in patients with normal kidneys. So they talked about using phenytoin. The theory, their hypothesis is that because phenytoin is a sodium channel blocker, it might inhibit these prolonged or potentiated action potentials that from the 4-AP. But they say, our patient didn't respond to the phenytoin, and they postulate that perhaps they should have given higher phenytoin loads. And they go on to talk about toxin-induced seizures differing from epileptiform seizures, as the toxin-induced seizures are due to a global lowering of this theoretical seizure threshold in otherwise normal neurons versus epileptiform seizures being caused by some focal lesion. And so they wondered if a higher dose of phenytoin maybe would have been effective. But it sounds like this patient, regardless, did have a good outcome despite a prolonged ICU stay.
Yeah, it's definitely a really bad case with a couple of weeks really in the hospital, seizing for 3 days, a super high level. Sort of I think the dogma, not always completely followed, but was that yes, benzos and GABAergic agents, propofol, should be used for drug-induced seizures, with the exception being aminopyridine for AP. But it really is poorly supported. There's some really old 30, 40-year-old case reports that maybe it worked, and I think the only reason it worked was that was really the only agent that they were using back then, and maybe the overdose wasn't as high as some of these could be. So something to worry about, a rare drug. It was looked at briefly as an antidote for calcium channel blockers, I'll say as sort of a factoid. It really doesn't probably work there because calcium channel blocker overdoses that we see with the typical agents are L channel, and this probably, if anything, only works at the P and Q channel to augment calcium influx rather than the ones we care about in the heart. So it's probably not useful for that. Dilantin's not useful for it. It's, again, supportive care. These animals who take it get agitated and seize. Humans who take it get agitated and seize. And I'll just say parenthetically that there's another form that's out there called 3,4-diaminopyridine. It was also known as amifampridine, which is used for Eaton-Lambert or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, depending whichever you grew up in. I think it's now called Eaton-Lambert syndrome, which is also a neurotoxic disease that affects the junctions. And it's got a early peak in 20 minutes. So if someone takes this, they'll also be quite sick quite quickly. And so to finish up, I think we need to come back to Harvard, because I'll tell the story that during the 1950s, Harvard Boston was overrun by pigeons. And this city was wondering what to do with it, and they decided to start a campaign of killing the pigeons with a variety of different poisonings that got the attention of a different Harvard professor who was good, a mathematician who used to tinker around at the piano and play in nightclubs at the time. And his first song that came out and launched a career away from math and into music was this. So we'll close with a little bit of Tom Lehrer.
But there's one thing that makes spring complete for me, and makes every Sunday a treat for me. All the world seems in tune on a spring afternoon when we're poisoning pigeons in the park. Every Sunday you'll see my sweetheart and me as we poison the pigeons in the park. When they see us coming, the birdies all try and hide, but they still go for peanuts when coated with cyanide. The sun's shining bright, everything seems alright when we're poisoning pigeons in the park. La la, la 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 la, we've gained notoriety and caused much anxiety in the Audubon Society with our games. They call it impiety and lack of propriety and quite a variety of unpleasant names. But it's not against any religion to want to dispose of a pigeon. So if someday you're free, why don't you come with me and we'll poison the pigeons in the park. And maybe we'll do in a squirrel or two while we're poisoning pigeons in the park. We'll murder them all amid laughter and merriment, except for the few we take home to experiment. My pulse will be quickening with each drop of strychnine we feed to a pigeon. It just takes a smidgen to poison a pigeon in the park.
All right, thanks, sis. I think every budding toxicologist from that era on knows about the infamous Tom Lehrer. So thank you, and we'll see you again, maybe with a different Tom Lehrer song.